Got your money's worth out of the Manhattan Project. But, quite frankly, we are at a time in our history right now where the site is being rejuvenated at a pace that we haven't seen, certainly since the Manhattan Project through the Cold War. Today, we are at a confluence of increased production due to world events. At the same time, we're still cleaning up the legacy from the Cold War and modernizing the site all at the same time in the same footprint. That's really the mission of Y-12. The mission of Y-12 for those sailors, for those airmen, for those pilots, right, is to take, have no doubt, have complete confidence in the product that we deliver is zero defect. All they have to do is do their job. We've already done ours, right? The thing that's on the pointy end of the spear will absolutely work, and that's where you get deterrence, right?
Thanks for joining me. Thanks for taking the time to sit down and chat. I'm interested to hear a little bit more about your past and what you're doing here today in Y-12 and Oak Ridge. So thanks for taking the time, sir.
All right. Well, thanks for coming here. So a little bit about my past. So I spent 27 and a half years in the nuclear Navy driving submarines for a living. After graduating from West Virginia University as a mechanical engineer. So, from there, retired about 11 years ago now and came to East Tennessee where I started my journey here at the Y-12 National Security Complex. So, of course, Y-12's been around for quite some time. Y-12 itself sits on the northeast corner of 33,700 acres in a federal reservation that we share with Oak Ridge National Laboratories just across our ridge to the south. And previous to that, also shared ground in this same federal reservation with K-25, which was a uranium enrichment complex that has subsequently been turned back over for industrial development, and that sits well west of us here on the federal reservation. And so, the story begins in Oak Ridge in the middle of 1942. With General Leslie Groves, 4 basic communities here all got letters on the same day saying the United States government is moving in a matter of national security interest. And starting in February of 1943, the United States, under a wartime footing, built 175 facilities in about 18 months here on the 3,000 acres, which is now Y-12. So I always found that kind of interesting because along with those 175 buildings were the 9 Calutron buildings that enriched uranium to form the center or the working part of Little Boy. Interesting part is all 9 of those Calutron buildings are still here. We still work in 3 of them today. So as taxpayers, you kind of got your money's worth out of the Manhattan Project. But, quite frankly, we are at a time in our history right now where the site is being rejuvenated at a pace that we haven't seen, certainly since the Manhattan Project through the Cold War. Today, we are at a confluence of increased production due to world events. At the same time, we're still cleaning up the legacy from the Cold War and modernizing the site all at the same time in the same footprint. So it's a very, very interesting and dynamic time to be part of Y-12. And it's certainly, back to my history, is a natural extension of a military career. All of the Patriots here at Y-12 serve the greater national security mission. We form national deterrence, and we take that very seriously every day when we come to work.
It's quite amazing to me when you look back at the history and just knowing how the United States government typically operates, the fact that they're in 18 months able to accomplish so much. But can you talk to me a little bit about why Oak Ridge? Why this spot? How did it come about?
Yeah, so I mean, you'll hear the hearsay and the lore about the Tennessee senator at the time, talking to the military about, we're going to build this site now. Where in Tennessee, sir, are you going to build it? But I think it was a little more logical than that. So when you go 10 years before that and you look at TVA and the New Deal, and the things that happen around this particular little valley when it comes to hydroelectric power and the Tennessee Valley Authority, this met a couple of very important, I think, logistical needs for the nation at the time. It had the electrical power, it had water system, it had sufficient highway systems, and yet it was kind of centered remotely, but yet accessible to several of the key urban hubs at the time. So I think there was a little more thought that went into the actual location, but I think electric power played a huge role in all of that. The calutrons themselves, of course, took a lot of power. Interesting, at the time, the resource limitations that were in the nation. You can read the stories about copper being in limited resources, etc. The calutrons themselves, the conductors were essentially a withdrawal from the national treasury in the form of silver. Tons and tons of silver were delivered here to form the conductors for the calutrons. And at the end of the day, I think probably by the early 70s, we return all of that silver back to the treasury, which is also a neat story. And I know our communications team can give the actual statistics, but I think we were like 0.3%, of silver that, was not accounted for when we sent it all back to the treasury. So pretty good given 30 plus years, in an industrial facility. But that being said, the federal reservation itself, of course, you had the graphite reactor across the ridge at Oak Ridge National Laboratories, which used to be, code word X10, and then the other enrichment site, which was K25. So you kind of had these competing interests trying to figure out what was the best technology to enrich this uranium in a manner that we could get it out to Los Alamos for the project. And as it turned out, the calutrons, or the California University cyclotron, as the long word for it, was electromagnetic separation. And it worked well enough, but it really wasn't a commercial product, right? It was kind of getting the ice cream maker with the hand crank instead of the electric motor. You could get good ice cream out of it, but you're never going to produce enough for what the nation eventually needed. That became the K25 site and the gaseous diffusion site. So very, very shortly after the war, the calutrons went out of service, and Y12 really moved on to kind of what was the next mission for the 22,000 people that worked here at the peak of the war. That population rapidly diminished after the war as Y12 then began its journey to really what we are today, which is the nation's center of excellence for enriched uranium. We serve all three parts of our mission, which is the stockpile, which is really no surprise to anyone. Nuclear deterrence, maintaining a safe and effective stockpile. We play a critical role as a production agency in that. Global non-proliferation, that same expertise that does all of the enriched uranium mission is very transportable and very much in demand across the globe when it comes to using the material the correct way, making sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. And at the end of the day, if necessary, going out, characterizing it, packaging it, and safely storing it for future uses as deemed necessary by the NNSA. And then, of course, being the feedstock for naval reactors, near and dear to my heart as a submarine veteran. As long as naval reactors needs highly enriched uranium, Y12 will be there as the feedstock for that fuel. So a very, like I said, a vibrant mission that quickly evolved after the war. The calutrons were retired, all except for really kind of a couple of interesting parts here. So, in the midst of all of this modernization, two pieces will not be modernized, but they will be preserved. One is a building that we call 9204-3 or Beta 3. That was an original Beta Calutron building. It still has a full set of the racetrack of Beta Calutrons in it, the only full racetrack that still exists anywhere in the world. That will be preserved as part of the Manhattan Project National Historic Park. It is inside my high security area, so it's a bit problematic from a access standpoint. But I do believe that someday we will either provide virtual access in the near term or another method to, whether it be augmented or virtual reality, be able to, kind of walk the halls of that thing that helped the United States win World War II. And then we have the original building, the first building that was built here at the site, Building 9731. And that has both a single alpha, and a single beta calutron in it. And the interesting thing there is that's where the calutron girls went to be trained before they went out into the full production areas. So, very interesting. I think within the last year, we had one of the still living calutron girls come back and kind of sit in the seat right where she got trained before she went out and did her mission. And it's always interesting to hear, their stories where they talk about they didn't really know what they were doing. They knew what they were supposed to do when it came to, make this needle stay right here, turn this dial if it's going this direction. But even in throughout that whole project, things like the word uranium were classified, and you were not able to say any of that here in the secret city, so to speak. Which is also another interesting point because we always talk about how Y-12 was built in 18 months. We built a whole city here that didn't exist, right? There, that mission for the United States is the reason for an entire community existing today. And of course, now it is the vibrant hub of really new nuclear in East Tennessee. A lot of companies coming here. So it's reinventing itself as the nation's new nuclear renaissance takes hold, and we start talking about advanced modular reactors. We talk about small modular reactors and even fusion, all kind of moving into this area. So revitalizing Oak Ridge once again.
It's pretty cool that this much history was captured and maintained for a project that was top secret. And you see all the things, and obviously the security that's around here today, the fact that there is so much, because coming from the military, probably can see it's in top secret and classified environments. Usually you're not documenting a lot of stuff that's going to preserve or see the time or stand the test of time and see the light of day. So I find that it's pretty awesome to see just a bit of the history that exists here and how much you can see. Pretty cool. But that pivots to the point of today in Oak Ridge. You've already touched on a little bit. Y-12, why is it a necessity? Why does it exist? How does it fit into the puzzle today?
Yeah, so Y-12 National Security Complex is a NNSA, right, National Nuclear Security Administration site, and the purpose of the site is to be one of the major production agencies serving the nuclear deterrent and the stockpile, right? So our mission today is to produce the secondaries, the canned subassemblies for every weapon that's active in the stockpile. And that is a mission that is growing as the world develops. The current geopolitical situation develops, and the nation recognizes, that the linchpin for national security still remains our nuclear deterrent. So, exit the Cold War, the peace dividend comes. The site really is working on one thing at a time. It's a fairly steady drumbeat, but nothing more than one thing. Fast forward to today, the site is currently working on, depending on how you count it, 5 or 6 different weapons programs, unprecedented really since the Cold War, which is really causing us to bring in a larger workforce with a lot of critical skills necessary, obviously, to do the work. That is occurring on the site. That product goes right for its Department of Defense deliveries. We also have to, we send it out the door with the warranty that this is good for X number of years, but at the same time we don't rely on that. So we're also sampling that same stockpile deliverable every year and looking to make sure that that thing is behaving in the stockpile exactly as the scientists imagined it, right? We don't take anything for granted. All of that work, all of those engineering reports, all of that destructive and non-destructive testing all gets to the president at the end of the year and really certifies that the stockpile is safe and effective. We call that our surveillance program. And that is a crucial part of really being a credible deterrent, is understanding that what you built is doing exactly what you said it was going to do once you deploy it into the field. So that work goes on, as well as building the thing, making sure it's doing exactly as you want. And then when the president and Congress says we no longer need this in the stockpile, those pieces come back to us. And because the nation no longer enriches uranium to weapons grade anymore, that material is harvested, it's recycled, it's safely packaged and stored for future use in a future weapon system. So that dismantlement part goes on every year as well. So the part of the Y-12 mission that serves the credible nuclear deterrent has grown by leaps and bounds, and it's really just one part of what we're doing today. We also, as I alluded to maybe a little bit earlier, because we have that expertise in enriched uranium and radioactive material, and we have to secure that. So we have a lot of experts when it comes to security and what security should look like for that type of material. That expertise is exported as well under global non-proliferation. So our team operates around the globe every year. We can assess facilities in other countries. We can educate folks in other countries. More important, quite frankly, to me personally, is that same expertise is applied domestically for communities that have medical facilities with radioisotopes, right? It would be awesome if that staff with that radioisotope, if they had a fire, they knew exactly what to do to make it safe. If they had a natural disaster, they knew exactly what calls needed to be made with local first responders, right? So, the punchline there is, well, where do you get that kind of training? Turns out you get it here. So that those same experts we offer through our global non-proliferation profile, we offer that training. We can bring those whole staffs here. We can take them through all of the eventualities. They can prepare their emergency response plans. They can work with their local first responders to make sure they have all of the right contacts so that in the event in your community a natural disaster occurs, the material is going to be safe. It's going to remain exactly where we want it to remain. And the community, quite frankly, probably will never even know, all of the work that it took in order for that to happen. So that is really another one of those things where we're just serving a mission that's much larger than ourselves here in Y12. And I think that's a really neat part of what we're doing. But so then, on top of all of that, from the time the Cold War until today, I will just say we being the nation, really didn't invest in the infrastructure in these types of facilities. We kind of took the peace dividend and we went on our merry way. And of course, today we recognize that the peace dividend was only good for so long. So these facilities, some of which now are approaching 80 years, really need some loving care. And in some instances, they're just beyond the point where we just have to replace them, right? They're not going to get any better. So the only way really to retire that risk is to replace it. So on site today, the nation is investing in two major projects: the uranium processing facility, which is the key critical capability here, enriched uranium processing. That facility is under construction today. It's greater than 80 or 70% complete. Looking forward to moving into that very, in the near future. And what that really brings is a modern facility, of course, but more importantly, it really leaps the workforce into the future. So when you think of how we have worked with uranium for the last, 5 or 6 decades, we rely a whole lot on PPE, and the worker, quite frankly, is wrapped up in the saran wrap, and the hazard is kind of everywhere around the worker. Fast forward to the uranium processing facility, right? That hazard now is in a glove box. The worker is in street clothes. They do their job, aided by robotics, aided by technology, and they do that work. They hang up, their lab coat or whatever, and they go home. So when you're talking about hiring the next generation of worker here at Y12, right, that is the tagline, that's the advertisement, and it's much more attractive, quite frankly. So, if you want your child to come to work here, that's the environment that you want to sell to them. And we're doing something very similar with our lithium processing facility. Again, a hazardous material, very reactive, putting it in a modern piece of infrastructure, getting it out of the repurposed Calutron building that it's in now is critical to Y12 being able to execute its mission well into the mid 2040s, 2050s for the nation. So a lot of work going on there. And then we've got to clean up the rest of the legacy. So Department of Energy Environmental Management and they're partnering, their M&O prime contractor UCOR is here on the site at the same time, and they're demolishing the facilities that we no longer use, remediating the ground, and turning that back over to be flat ground that we can recapitalize moving forward. So a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, a lot of moving pieces. One aspect I would like to touch on, the lithium piece you just mentioned. I read recently an article on the Y12 website. Not a lithium engineer myself. I realize the process to make lithium, you need it for nuclear, but it's also very hazardous and very toxic in the process. It looks like there have been some breakthroughs here when it comes to production of lithium, doing it in, a cold manner, and it's a lot more environmental friendly and safer just for workers. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit, I guess. So, the predominant process today is the same process that you would find in any commercial lithium factory. But to the point I think that you're making is if you want to continue that in a less hazardous manner moving forward, you either need, a breakthrough technology to essentially for us purify the lithium, or you need to somehow remove the human being from the process associated with what we currently do today. We're working on both of those. There is a process, essentially a cold separation process that is in research and development. And, we will hopefully advance that to the point where it could reach production state moving forward. And that would remove the whole piece of what you see in the commercial industry, which is essentially an electrolytic cell that is used to produce the lithium metal. And at the end of the day, would be far less from a hazardous standpoint. So we'd like to get there. But I think the intermediate step is essentially automating that commercial process. No one else does it in the world, but our team is also looking at how do you automate that lithium cells so that there's no worker interaction, there's automatic feed, there's automatic withdrawal. It's all in an enclosed environment. That will probably be the next technology step, and we're really, really excited about that. And then eventually we'll get to the point maybe where we don't need that electrochemical process at all moving forward.
I think kind of is a very political correct way of saying secondaries, which I would imagine is the big boom, the nuclear stockpile. But that ties back into your prior life in submarines. And when I think of submarines, I know there's different classes, but the nuclear triad. Can you talk to me about the nuclear triad? And most of the listeners probably are somewhat familiar with it, but if you can give just a little chat about that and then tie into what you did in the Navy.
Okay, so sure. So first off, the triad, right? So obviously there's three pieces. We'll start with the bomber fleet. You have the bomber fleet, which can be responsive and very agile, obviously because, being manned aircraft, etc., that is a very useful thing for command and control because you could talk to the pilot, you could set up the mission. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that you really thought a lot about when the situation developed. The ICBMs, which is our most responsive leg of the triad. So currently the Minuteman forms the backbone of I'll just say the land-based leg of the triad. And then you have the sea-based leg, which is the most survivable leg of the triad, which is your submarine force. So now back to my background. So I first served on one of the 41 for Freedom, which was the Benjamin Franklin class of SSBN fleet ballistic missile submarines that carried a form of the Trident missile, the C4 missile, the precursor, of course, to what we have today. And then my second tour at sea was on the USS Rhode Island. I was the strategic weapons officer on the Rhode Island, which is outfitted with the Trident II D5 weapon system, which is, of course, the modern deployable sea-based portion of the Triad today. So, even that leg of the Triad, along with everything else, is being modernized. You've heard the Columbia class is coming, but until that time, the Tridents have to, continue to go to sea. And how that happens is those submarines have two crews, a gold crew and a blue crew. The blue crew will go to sea, execute its mission. The gold crew will be doing training, preparing for the ship to return to port. As soon as the ship returns to port, the crew will go down to the waterfront. There will be a turnover. A maintenance period will ensue. Really, both crews dig in to make sure that submarine is ready to go back to sea. And within a month, that submarine goes back to sea. So you really get your bang for your buck out of the platform. So they stay at sea quite a bit. My tie here with the submarine force, where the current job is, through all of that as the weapons officer, you do countless countdowns. You practice over and over again. You run your crew through all the drills. You do, simulated launches. You respond to exercise messages. Through all of that, I never once thought that the thing that was on the end of that missile wasn't going to work. Right? That was just a given. We had to make sure that we as sailors didn't screw it up. But if we didn't screw it up and we got that thing airborne, right, it was going to do its job. So fast forward to today, that's really the mission of Y-12. The mission of Y-12 for those sailors, for those airmen, for those pilots, right, is to take, have no doubt, have complete confidence in the product that we deliver is zero defect. All they have to do is do their job. We've already done ours, right? The thing that's on the pointy end of the spear will absolutely work, and that's where you get deterrence, right? The enemy knows that the sailors and the airmen and the pilots are all going to do their job, and they absolutely know that the thing on the end of that pointy spear is going to work. And if you have all of that, right, people say, well, you've never used a nuclear weapon. And of course, the response to that is we use them every day. We use them every day as deterrent because we do our job in a manner that provides, those that would do the nation's harm, second thoughts about anything that they might do because they know the deterrent is credible.
100%. What was your most challenging time in the submarine world?
So the most challenging time in the submarine world. So, it's just like a lot of other things in the world, the threat changed throughout my career, right? There was a day when it was deep blue ocean submarines, you just you ran around happy in nice deep water. And then, we got to Desert Storm, we got into the Middle East, we got into the global war on terror. And all of a sudden, the submarine force found themselves in water. If you stood the submarine on end, 2/3 of it would stick out of the water that you were in. So, the most challenging time for me, quite frankly, was executing shallow water missions where, generally speaking, you would be on station for up to 30 days at a time before you came off and got a break. And, the old joke was, between us and the Brits and the Aussies and all the other submarine forces that form our allies was, you stayed there for 30 days because the captain couldn't stay awake any longer than 30 days. Not really true, but it's very taxing on the crew, right? You don't have that third dimension for crew safety, so you got to be on top of your game at all times. And it's not all just, the bad guys are out there. If you're in water that's that shallow and you're sharing it with a super tanker, well, guess what? There's nowhere to go. Right. So you better be on top of your game and get out of the way because he's certainly not going to see you being submerged. And then those same waters are waters fished over and over and over again. So, I apologize in advance for, all of the fishermen who went home without nets or whatever. But, that was the congested world that we were living in as I finished my submarine service. And it was incredibly challenging to operate in those littorals and, doing the things that needed to be done for the global war on terror and being ready to provide the strike support for missions like Desert Storm. All were very good reasons to be there, but it certainly was a big time change in the operating environment.
What was the highlight of your submarine time?
Highlight of my submarine time, I would say without a doubt, taking command of a fast attack submarine and taking it out of port knowing that you were about to go on deployment. Seeing the land lights disappear behind you. In my case, it was Honolulu as we left Pearl Harbor and headed out to Westpac. But what a feeling to be in command of something. Almost nowhere else in the world is the command structure so isolated as it is on a submarine on deployment. Yep, you could talk to your boss these days, but he's not looking over your shoulder, right? And anything that matters has to be decided on that platform. So, all the training, the whole career, all of the dreams and aspirations of crews, et cetera, all kind of roll up, you hit the edge of the channel and you make that right turn and you head to Westpac from Honolulu in command. Man, that was awesome.
Yeah. Pretty incredible. I mean, you're out there, more or less, you're alone. Yeah. To say the least.
Yeah. And again, that's part of, another unspoken part of maybe not the nuclear deterrent, but a deterrent is, those submarines are forward deployed and no one knows where, from an enemy standpoint, no one knows where they are and they're all quite capable, quite frankly. So it's a pretty cool thing to do.
Absolutely. What was your longest time without seeing topside there?
So it took quite a while because people ask me that question a long time. So the longest I was ever submerged without actually coming up and seeing the sun or doing anything was 57 days. That was actually earlier in my career, which is kind of neat when you think about it. But, that's the way we operated, way more isolated, way, more in the deep water early in my career. Of course, when now, you have to essentially sample the environment. That's not my phone, by the way. But you got to be able to sample the environment and collect the intel and the mission parameters now. So you're almost always at that water air interface. When you're dealing with these littoral environments. So it's a big time difference.
Perfect. As we kind of wrap up here, what's something that I haven't asked you think would be important for the listeners and viewers to know about Y-12, nuclear security, et cetera?
Well, I think Y-12, really is a critical part of nuclear security. But what I really would, I think, for a parting shot here is for the men and women that actually work at Y-12, that are Y-12, and in many instances, this is a generational workforce. But the mission, is refreshingly new. The talent that is coming here, we hear all the time about, all the worries about talent leaving the door. And I will just tell you, what's happening here and what's happening across many of the NNSA sites is we are bringing talent in that is incredible. And they have, in most instances, bought into this, this large mission set and are off doing the nation's work. So I am quite, I would just say, inspired by the workforce. We need talent at all levels. We need supply chain, we need engineers, we need pipe fitters, we need electricians. All of those people come to work here at Y-12 every day to deliver the mission, and it's quite inspiring to watch them do that.
Well, sir, thanks for taking the time. It was a pleasure to be able to sit down and chat with you, learn a little bit about you, a little bit more about Y-12.
John, my pleasure.
Thanks, sir.
16, 15,000,